I've never been the type who likes to explore abandoned buildings, but that night I let my friends convince me. Logan, one of the bravest in the group, said he had heard of a decommissioned factory on the outskirts of the city, a place that had already been the target of local stories. They said that work accidents had already happened there and that the place had been suddenly closed. For them, it was just fun and adrenaline. For me, it was just discomfort. The main entrance was completely locked, with chains and warning signs, but a side window had a broken glass and seemed to be the only way. Reluctantly, I followed them, passing carefully so as not to cut myself. The air inside was heavy, it smelled of rust and mold, as if time had accumulated in every corner. The silence was almost absolute, interrupted only by the sound of our own footsteps and the water dripping somewhere. We lighted the lanterns and started walking through the rusty corridors. The walls were peeled, full of old graffiti and infiltration stains. I felt like I shouldn't be there, but my friends laughed and made jokes to lighten the mood. Deep down, I think we all knew there was something wrong in that environment. We reached a staircase that led to the basement. It was narrow and noisy, every step creaked as if it was going to give in at any moment. The darkness there was so dense that even with the lanterns it seemed that the light was swallowed by the air. Logan insisted that we should go down, and even against my will, I followed along, trying not to be left behind. The smell got stronger when we got underground, a mixture of rust and moisture. The floor was covered with pieces of concrete and rusty cans. It was then that, when we turned a corner, our lanterns lit up something that made my stomach freeze. 3 people were shrunken in a corner, motionless, as if they were sleeping. At first, I thought they were dolls or maybe homeless people looking for shelter. But there was something strange in the way they were positioned, with their knees glued to their chests and their heads down, too immobile, almost artificial. No one made the slightest movement, even when the light hit them directly. My friend made a joke, saying out loud that we had found company. I was about to ask us to come back when suddenly, one of the figures slowly raised his head. The eyes were open, fixed on us. I didn't blink, I didn't say anything. I just stared with an intensity that made my body paralyze. The sensation was immediate. That was not normal. The way he watched us had nothing human in the common sense. It was an empty look and, at the same time, loaded with something I couldn't describe. We were all silent for a few seconds that seemed eternal. Logan tried to break the tension by asking if they were okay, but no one answered. The other 2 figures remained motionless, without even raising their heads. The only sound was the echo of our accelerated breathing. I could feel my heart beating in my neck, as if it was going to explode. Without waiting any longer, I took 2 steps back and whispered that we needed to leave. That's when the man who was watching us moved. First, he turned his neck to the side in a strange way, as if he were testing a movement. Then, he took a slow step forward, without taking his eyes off us. No one shouted, but we all retreated at the same time. We stumbled up the stairs, with the noise of our steps echoing through the corridor. I didn't have the courage to look back. I felt that, if I did that, I would see them following, and I was not prepared to confirm this possibility. When we finally crossed the window and fell out, we stood in the empty parking lot, panting, unable to believe what had just happened. None of us said anything for long minutes, as if we were still trying to process what we had seen. To this day, I can't explain who those people were, nor why they were in that dark basement. But I know what I saw, eyes that stared at us in a way that I will never forget. And since that night, I never accepted to explore an abandoned building again. Story 2. I never liked to risk entering abandoned buildings, but that night I went with some friends who loved this kind of adventure. The place chosen was an old hotel in Detroit, an 8-story building that had already been the scene of fires and evictions, and which now was nothing more than a forgotten carcass. From the entrance, the smell of mold and rust was already suffocating. The windows were broken, and the street around seemed so deserted that we felt isolated from the rest of the city. Each floor seemed more deteriorated than the previous one. The corridors were full of garbage, broken furniture, and torn carpets that stank of urine. Our lanterns cut through the darkness, but nothing illuminated completely. Each shadow seemed to move. Each broken door seemed to hide something. The silence was only interrupted by the sound of our own footsteps and the distant echo of the rain hitting metal roofs outside. On the 5th floor, we were already thinking about stopping, but Logan insisted on going up to the last one. According to him, it was there that the strange stories of the hotel used to happen. I didn't want to, but I followed, without the courage to be the only one to be left behind. climbing the narrow stairs, creaking, gave the feeling that at any moment the structure could give way. When we finally reached the 8th floor, the air became even heavier. The corridor was almost all destroyed, with pieces of ceiling fallen on the floor and doors torn off the hinges. The stench on that floor was different, stronger, and almost unbearable. A smell of accumulated dirt, old sweat, and something else, something I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach wrap. That's when we saw. In one of the rooms, an old mattress was thrown in the corner, and on it was a man lying. His skin looked dirty, covered with dirt, and next to it were some belongings scattered, a torn backpack, empty bottles, and rotten food remains. The smell came from there, without a doubt. He was motionless, with his chest rising and falling slowly, taking a deep breath. At that first moment, we thought he was sleeping. My friends even made a joke, as if he were a dweller of the hotel we had accidentally found. But there was something wrong. Even when we talked loudly and even dropped a piece of wood on the ground, the man didn't move. Nothing but deep and rhythmic breathing. It was this breathing that made me restless. It was too exaggerated, as if it was forced. It wasn't the natural sound of someone in deep sleep, but something deliberate, as if he wanted us to believe he was sleeping. My heart raced when I realized that he was actually pretending. I was paralyzed at the door, staring at that motionless body. My mind screamed for me to get out of there, but at the same time it was as if I was trapped, hypnotized by the strangeness of the situation. My friends began to move away, laughing nervously, but I couldn't look away. It was disturbing to be so close to someone who clearly knew of our presence, but who refused to react. So by instinct, I took a step back, and at that very moment I noticed a detail that made me freeze. Next to the mattress, on the floor, there was a rusty kitchen knife, positioned near his hand. He didn't move, but seemed ready to react to any of our movements. That's when I realized how exposed and vulnerable we were on that isolated floor. I whispered to the others that we should leave. They agreed immediately, and we began to retreat in silence, trying not to make noise. With every step back, I felt as if his eyes were open, accompanying us, even without having the courage to confirm it. His breathing seemed to get heavier as we moved away. We ran down the stairs, stumbling on the steps, until we left the building. No one said anything for long minutes. We were just trying to catch our breath, still in shock. The image of that motionless body, that fake breathing, was engraved in my mind as something much more threatening than if he had simply stood up. To this day, I remember the smell, the knife on the floor, and the suffocating certainty that, if we had stayed one more minute, maybe he wouldn't have kept pretending to sleep. Story 3. I always liked to explore old buildings, but that night something told me not to go. Still, I followed my friends to an abandoned school that was at the end of the city, a building closed since the 70s. The place was huge, with broken windows and bricks darkened by time. We used flashlights, but even so the darkness seemed to swallow us at every step. The silence was so dense that it gave the impression that the building was watching us. We walked through the corridors, passing by destroyed wallets, scratched blackboards, and piles of moldy books. The dust rose with every movement, and the floor creaked as if it were going to give way. I tried to stay calm, but the feeling that we shouldn't be there only increased. That's when I noticed a rusty door at the end of a side corridor. Unlike the others, it seemed to have been closed on purpose, with chains cut on the floor. I approached, and with some effort, I managed to push her. The metallic sound echoed through the entire building, and for a moment I thought someone was going to show up to stop us. But what I found in there made my heart race. It was a different room from all the others. The walls were covered with symbols that I did not recognize, some drawn in the form of circles, others made in a hurry, like Garankos. On the floor, there were worn candles, some still stuck to the melted wax that accumulated in heaps. The smell of burning and humidity was unbearable, as if that place had been used recently, despite the abandoned appearance. The wallets were all pushed to the corners, freeing the center of the room, where the symbols were concentrated. My friends came in behind me, and were silent. None of them made fun, something rare when we explored places like this. There were sentences written in red on the walls, some blurred by humidity, but still readable. Things like "He's still here," and "Don't look back." I didn't want to admit it, but it didn't look like ordinary ink. With each step inside the room, the weight on the chest increased. The air seemed colder, and the flashlight shook in my hand. I bent down to take a closer look at one of the sentences, and noticed that the paint flowed towards the baseboard, as if it had been applied carelessly. But the strangest thing was the feeling that someone had written that to be read exactly by us as a warning. Ethan, the bravest friend, started photographing everything with his cell phone. The camera click echoed too loud in space, and that only made me more nervous. I kept standing still, with the impression that we shouldn't register anything from there. It was then that I noticed a chair facing the wall, with deep scratch marks on the backrest, as if someone had been forced to sit there. At that moment, an icy wind passed through the room, even though all the windows were closed. The worn candles swayed as if they had just been lit and extinguished. My friends exchanged glances, and I felt the urge to get out of there immediately. But the door we had forced began to creak by itself, closing slowly behind us. The noise made everyone freeze. We ran to the exit before it closed completely, pushing hard until it opened again. The corridor seemed different now, darker, more hostile. I had the clear feeling that something had been left behind, but at the same time that something had also followed us out. We ran down the corridors until we reached the school exit, stumbling on the wreckage. Outside, the cold morning air has never seemed so comforting. But none of us said anything for a few minutes. We were just breathing heavily, trying to believe that it had been just coincidence, just imagination. To this day, I can't get out of my mind the image of those symbols, the sentences in red, and the oppressive silence of the room. Whenever I remember, I have the feeling that we left something unfinished in there, as if we had interrupted something that should never have started. Story 4. I should never have entered that hospital. It was a huge construction, surrounded by tall bush and broken windows, in the countryside of Georgia. I went there with the excuse of urban exploration, but deep down I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. The facade was all peeled, and the main doors had been sealed with old boards. I found a side entrance, forcing a rusty metal window. Inside, the smell of mold and rust was suffocating. The corridors were long, with doors falling from the hinges, papers scattered on the floor and graffiti covering the walls. The wind entered through the cracks and caused everything to creak, but the silence remained heavier than any noise. I advanced slowly, with the flashlight shaking in my hand, listening to my own steps echoing through the empty building. After a few minutes exploring, I found a locked door, unlike the others. She had an almost erased sign that said Room 302. The lock was rusty, but it seemed to have been forced before. Something in me screamed not to move, but the curiosity was stronger. With a push, the wood gave way, creaking loudly in the silent corridor. When I opened it, the first thing I noticed was the moonbeam entering through the broken window and illuminating the center of the room. There alone there was an old wheelchair, with torn upholstery and crooked wheels. The contrast of that intact chair in the middle of the rest of the ruined hospital made my stomach turn. I entered slowly, trying to convince myself that it was just another forgotten object. I approached the chair, observing the thick layer of accumulated dust. But what gave me goosebumps was noticing circular marks on the floor, as if it had been moved in circles again and again. It was impossible not to notice that those marks were recent, as if someone still used it. That's when I heard 2 steps into the room, and suddenly, a metallic sound echoed through the corridor behind me. It looked like something dragging, like iron scraping against the floor. I froze in place, my heart beating so loud that I thought it would betray me. Every second, the noise got closer. I slowly turned the flashlight towards the corridor, but I didn't see anything. The light beam illuminated only dust suspended in the air, floating. Still, the sound continued, paused, as if someone was dragging a metal bar or an old stretcher. I could swear it was coming exactly in my direction. I took a step back, and my backpack touched the wheelchair. The shrill sound of the metal against the hospital floor echoed, and I froze when I realized that I hadn't touched so hard. It was as if the chair had moved by itself, sliding a few centimeters forward. At this point, I no longer knew whether to run or try to stay calm. I pointed the flashlight back at the corridor, and for a second I had the impression of seeing a shadow crossing from one wall to the other. It was too fast to identify, but enough to make me tremble all over. Without thinking, I ran out of the room. The metallic sound followed me down the corridor, louder and louder, as if it were behind me. I didn't look back. I just kept running until I found the emergency ladder. I went down the steps almost stumbling, with the feeling that something was coming right above, dragging it on the floor. When I finally reached the side exit where I had entered, I pushed the window with all my strength and fell into the trace outside. The cold air of the dawn hit my face, and only then did I realize that I was sweaty and panting. The silence outside seemed so different from the silence inside, as if I had crossed back to the real world. To this day I don't know what I saw or heard in that hospital. The metallic sound haunts me in my dreams, and the image of that wheelchair under the moonlight has never left my mind. I didn't go back there, and I know I'll never go back. But sometimes I still wake up at dawn with the feeling that someone is pushing something down the hallway of my house. Story 5. I've always had the strange habit of exploring abandoned buildings at night. For many people this sounds insane, but for me it was a kind of addictive adrenaline. In addition, I like to record photos of these places and post them online. That night didn't seem different. I took my camera, a flashlight, and went to an empty shed a few blocks from my house. The place had already been a packaging factory and had been closed for more than 20 years. I entered through a side where the wall was broken and spent almost an hour walking inside, recording the details of the rust, the graffiti, and the ceiling smelling. The silence was total, only interrupted by the sound of water dripping from the drips. When I finished, it was almost midnight. I left the same side where I had entered, but soon I realized something that shouldn't be there. A white van parked near the entrance. At first I thought it was a coincidence. It was stopped with the headlights off, without a logo or any identification. The front window reflected the street light, so I couldn't see if there was someone inside. My first reaction was to pretend I hadn't noticed. I put the camera in my backpack and started walking normally on the sidewalk, trying not to be in a hurry. I walked an entire block, hearing only the noise of my own steps. When I turned the corner, I risked looking back. The van was moving slowly, following my route, as if it had waited for me to move away from the shed to start walking. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself that it could be someone just looking for an address or parking. With each street it crossed, the vehicle was still behind, maintaining a constant distance. I felt the sweat running down the back of my neck, even with the cold of the dawn. I decided to change the usual way home and entered parallel streets, less lit. The van made exactly the same movements, as if mirroring my steps. That's when I realized it wasn't a coincidence. I picked up my cell phone to call someone, but the battery had run out inside the shed. I was completely alone, walking in deserted streets with a white van following me a few meters away. My breathing was out of step, and I no longer knew if I should run or keep walking. Deep down, I knew that running might only cause a worse reaction. I passed by a small square, where a single pole illuminated part of the path. That's where I risked turning abruptly to the opposite side, pretending I had forgotten something. The van slowed down, stopped for a few seconds, and then resumed the route, this time slowly coming towards me. The noise of the low engine seemed more threatening than any scream. I hid behind a thick tree in the square, holding my breath. The van passed very slowly, almost dragging the wheels, until it disappeared on the next corner. I waited a few seconds before leaving the hiding place, my ears attentive to any engine sound coming back. The silence seemed even heavier at that moment. I decided not to go straight home. I was afraid of being followed to my real address. I walked for 3 more blocks, changing streets whenever possible, trying to draw a confusing route. With every shadow I saw, I imagined the van appearing again. It took me almost half an hour to create courage and go back to my neighborhood. When I finally got to the street where I live, I looked to both sides before crossing. No sign of the van. I quickly entered the house and locked all the doors, still with the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the night unable to sleep, with my ears attentive to any engine noise outside. The next morning, I tried to rationalize the situation, telling myself that it could have been just a coincidence. But deep down I knew. The way that vehicle followed me through entire blocks, without ever overtaking or moving away, was no coincidence. Since then, whenever I'm on a deserted street and see headlights in the rearview mirror, I feel the same pressure in my chest, as if that van were back. I never went back to the shed on that corner. And to be honest, I also never managed to explore abandoned buildings in the same way. The adrenaline I was looking for was replaced by something different. The feeling that night, I crossed paths with someone who might have been choosing me as a target. Story 6. I was always attracted to abandoned places, and a school that was about 20 minutes from my house had been drawing my attention for months. I had already been there during the day a few times, but I never had the courage to go in alone. On a Saturday night, I made the impulsive decision to take only a flashlight, my small backpack, and cell phone for registration. When I crossed the front door, partially fallen, the smell of mold was the first thing that hit me. The corridors were full of broken wallets, scattered papers, and recent graffiti. The silence was so dense that each step echoed against the walls. As I explored, I clearly heard the repeated sound of dripping water, an insistent drip that seemed to come from the stairs that led to the basement. Curiosity won common sense, and I decided to go down. The air got colder as I moved forward. The flashlight illuminated the staircase covered with dirt and rust marks. When I reached the end, I realized that the basement was partially flooded. The dirty water rose to my ankles, cold and fetid, mixed with rotten leaves and small pieces of wood. Each movement made a loud splash sound, breaking the absolute silence of the place. I walked slowly, trying not to think about what could be in that standing water. The dim light of the flashlight reflected on the floor, creating distorted images, as if there were other movements besides mine. It was then that, in one of the reflections, I clearly saw a shadow moving right behind me. A tall figure, without a defined shape, passing in silence. The heart shot, and without thinking, I quickly turned back. The light of the flashlight ran through the damp corridor, revealing only peeling walls and partially open old doors. There was no one. I stood still for a few seconds, with accelerated breathing, trying to convince myself that it was just a reflection caused by the movement of the flashlight and water. Still, something inside me said it wasn't just that. I walked a few more meters, observing every detail. The leaks were stronger there, forming circles on the dark surface of the water. The sound echoed as if the entire building was breathing along with me. Each splash reminded me that I was alone, in the basement of an abandoned building that no one had visited for years. Suddenly, I heard a snap coming from my left. I directed the flashlight light and saw one of the doors moving slightly, as if it had been pushed inside. I felt a chill down my spine and took a step back, my mind fighting between running or continuing to explore. The water stirred around me, as if something had passed through it in silence. I slowly approached the door, trying to take a deep breath. When I touched the rusty doorknob, I realized it was too cold, as if it had just been wet. I pushed the door carefully, and it creaked loudly. The space behind her was empty, just more accumulated water, but the sound of the dripping had stopped. The silence that took over seemed much heavier than the noise from before. At that moment, I realized that it didn't make sense to continue. It was getting harder and harder to distinguish what was real and what was the result of fear. I decided to go back up the stairs, but when I took the first step, I heard a splash right behind, as if someone had taken a step in the water. I turned the flashlight quickly, nothing but undulations spreading on the surface. I hurried up the stairs, trying not to stumble. Each step seemed higher than the previous one, and the echo of my steps seemed to be accompanied by others slower and heavier, who came from the bottom of the basement. I didn't have the courage to look back this time. I just followed until I reached the upper floor, feeling my legs tremble. When I got back to the main corridor, I closed the basement door tightly, as if that would prevent whatever was down there from leaving. I leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath, listening to the sound of the rain outside mixing with the internal silence of the school. Only then did I realize how much I was shaking. I never went back to that school. Whenever I pass by and hear the sound of the water hitting the manholes of the street, I remember the reflection I saw in the stagnant water in the basement. I could never convince myself that it was just a play of light. And to this day, when I close my eyes, I feel as if there is still someone standing behind me in that darkness. Story 7. I've always been curious to explore abandoned buildings, but nothing prepared me for the night I decided to enter that old commercial building in the city center. The facade was huge, with broken windows and badly nailed wooden plates covering some entrances. It seemed that no one had set foot inside for years, and that's exactly why I wanted to see what was there. I went up the first floors carefully, illuminating each dark corridor with the flashlight. The floor creaked under my feet, and the smell of dust mixed with rust made the air heavy. There were broken tables, files scattered, and some rooms still with furniture, as if they had been abandoned in a hurry. Until then, everything seemed as expected for a forgotten building in time. When I reached the fourth floor, something caught my attention. The ladder that led to the next level was completely blocked by thick boards, nailed in an improvised way, but firm enough to prevent the passage. The wood was aged and full of rust and dirt marks. I couldn't understand why someone did that just at that point. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to hear if there was any sound coming from above. That's when I heard footsteps. They were heavy, slow, as if someone walked from one side to the other, without the slightest concern to hide the presence. The sound echoed through the ceiling, and each step seemed to reverberate directly into my chest. My first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe it was just the wind, or some piece of loose structure. But the more I listened, the clearer it became that they were human steps. The rhythm was constant, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, as if the person was walking the entire floor above me. I squeezed the flashlight in my hands and thought about leaving. But, moved by a mixture of fear and curiosity, I took a few steps towards the boards, illuminating the cracks between them. All I could see was darkness. The sound of footsteps, however, stopped as soon as I approached, leaving such a sudden silence that my hands began to sweat. I tried to call, my voice almost didn't come out. "Is there anyone there?" No answer. Just the noise of the wind passing through some broken window above. I took a step back, trying to think about what I would do, when the steps started again, stronger, as if the person had run to the point above where I was standing. I felt the floor vibrate slightly under my feet, and that was enough for my heart to race. I turned around, ready to go down, but the drag noise, as if something heavy was pulled by the ground, made me stop. It was as if the thing up there wanted me to know it was moving. I ran to the stairs that went down, going down the steps as fast as I could without stumbling. My steps echoed along with the sound from up there, which seemed to accompany me, as if the presence followed my every movement. The feeling was that, if I didn't have that blockage, maybe something was already coming down behind me. When I got to the ground floor, I almost tripped when I crossed the rusty door outside. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but I could still hear the echo of the heavy steps, even though I was already on the street. It was as if the entire building had kept that sound in its structure. I came back a few weeks later, during the day, to see if I could find any explanation. The staircase was still blocked in the same way, intact. But what left me in shock was noticing shoe marks on the dust accumulated on the floor, right above the highest board. As if someone had really circulated around there, where theoretically no one should be. I never entered that building again. Whenever I pass by the street, I look at the windows of the blocked floor, wondering who or what still walks up there, not caring about being heard. Story 8. I've always been interested in abandoned places, but I never imagined that a simple visit to a disabled student dormitory could make me so uncomfortable. It was an old building, closed for years, which was in a forgotten part of the campus. Me and two friends, Josh and Emily, decided to enter a Friday night, just out of curiosity. There was nothing planned, just the desire to see what was left inside. The main corridor was covered in dust, with old papers scattered and open bedroom doors, revealing completely empty spaces. Most of the beds had been removed, and the closets were broken or without doors. The atmosphere was heavy, but not because of legends or ghost stories. It was the kind of dense silence that makes you realize that you are in a place where no one has stepped for a long time. We keep exploring from room to room, laughing nervously, and trying to record some videos with the cell phone. Most seemed identical, peeling walls, old furniture, dust accumulated in every corner. But when we opened a door at the end of the corridor, we found something that made us stop. Unlike the others, that room seemed tidy. The bed was made with apparently clean sheets, and on the table was a half-finished bottle of water. At the time, the weather changed. No one said anything, but we all felt the same thing. That space wasn't really abandoned. Someone had been there recently. The simple fact that the bottle was not covered with dust was enough to leave us on alert. I approached to check, and realized that there were still small drops of condensation in the plastic. There was no way it had been there for a long time. Josh was the first to say we should go out. Emily agreed immediately, and I didn't want to insist either. The room seemed out of place, as if we were invading something that should not be seen. We closed the door and started walking quickly down the corridor back to the exit, avoiding talking so as not to attract any unwanted attention. When we got to the ground floor and went to the front door, we all breathed a sigh of relief. The cold night air seemed better than ever. We were silent for a few minutes, as if we were trying to process what had just happened. There was no logical explanation for that room to be like that, unless someone still used the dormitory. Curious, but still nervous, we went around the outside of the building. The idea was to look through the windows to see if we saw any movement. The windows were covered with dust, and many of them were broken, but when we got to the side of the building, something caught our attention. In the room we had just left, the curtain moved slightly, as if someone was standing behind it. I froze. Emily grabbed my arm hard, asking softly if I had also seen it. Josh stared, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was the wind, maybe some window was open on the other side. But the problem was that the entire building smelled of mold and was closed. No other curtain moved, only that one. We decided to take a few steps back, keeping our eyes fixed on the window. The curtain kept swinging, as if it had just been touched by someone. It wasn't the random wind movement. It seemed like a soft, rhythmic oscillation, as if someone had passed his hand and then stopped. At that moment, I felt that there was really someone inside. My instinct screamed for us to leave immediately, but my curiosity made me pick up my cell phone and film it. The video showed the curtain motionless at first, then starting to move again. When I zoomed in, for a second, I swear I saw something like a shadow behind the fabric. You couldn't distinguish the face, just a contour. We ran to the car, and no one said anything until we were a few blocks away. Emily was pale, and Josh didn't stop looking through the rearview mirror, as if he expected to see someone coming after us. I tried to laugh to break the tension, but my voice failed. The feeling was that we had been observed all the time inside. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept reviewing the video several times, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the shadow. But the more I looked, the more it seemed real. The curtain moved as if someone was breathing behind it. I never deleted the video, but I also never showed it to anyone else. Days later, I found out that dormitory had been closed after reports of strange people entering and using the rooms to shelter. Nothing official, just rumors among college employees. But for me, that explained at least part of the mystery. Still, I can't get out of my head the fact that we entered an abandoned place and saw clear signs that we weren't alone. To this day, I avoid going through that street. And whenever I think of the tidy room and the curtain that moved, I feel a chill run down my back. Maybe someone lives there secretly, maybe it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I know there were eyes watching us. Story 9. I've always had a certain fascination with abandoned buildings, and that night I decided to explore an old commercial building that had closed in the 90s. I learned that the place had been used by small businesses, but since then it was completely forgotten, with broken windows and graffiti on the outer walls. I entered through the back door, which was ajar, and immediately smelled the strong smell of dust and wet wood. The silence inside was suffocating. Every step I took echoed through the long and dark corridors, and the light of my flashlight could barely pass through the dust suspended in the air. I was alone, but I had this uncomfortable feeling that any strange noise would multiply by the echo and come back to me, as if the entire building was alive and paying attention. When I reached the central gap, I saw a narrow staircase that led to the upper floors. I decided to go up to record some photos. With each step, the sound of wood and iron creaking seemed to increase, as if I was being denounced to whoever was in there. However, I heard nothing but my own breathing and the distant buzzing of the rain outside. That's when, in the middle of the climb, I clearly heard footsteps coming from above. But there was something wrong. It wasn't the sound of someone moving away, but of someone coming down towards me, in a hurry, with weight, as if running up the same flight of stairs I was climbing. The sound echoed, reverberated through the walls, filling the environment with a palpable presence. My heart raced. I stopped in the middle of the flight of stairs, and pointed the flashlight up. The beam of light trembled along with my hand, illuminating only more steps and the rusty handrail. But the steps continued, getting closer and closer, to the point where I expected to see someone appear right before me. And then silence. A brutal silence, cut only by the sound of rain hitting the broken glass. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that the echo could be playing tricks on me, that maybe it was the sound of my own steps reflecting strangely in that space. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I decided to keep going up, slower, my eyes fixed on the top of the stairs. When I finally reached the next floor, I turned the flashlight to the corridor. It was long and narrow, with office doors on both sides. Some were ajar, others completely broken, revealing empty rooms full of torn papers and broken furniture. It was at that moment that I heard an even worse sound, a scream. It wasn't a normal scream. It sounded distant, muffled, but still human, loaded with dread. It came from one of the rooms to my right, echoing through the corridor as if it had gone through decades of silence. The sound froze my blood. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand if that could have come from outside the building, maybe from the street. But there was no way. The sound was internal, clearly coming from that floor, from inside one of the dark rooms in front of me. The flashlight shook even more in my hand, and I realized that I was starting to sweat cold despite the cold air. I tried to take a few steps towards the door, where I thought the sound had come from. The floor creaked under my feet, and each noise seemed too loud. When I got close to the living room, I saw that the door was just leaning. I pushed slowly with the tip of my foot, and she slowly opened, revealing an empty space, only with a table fallen to the floor and some chairs turned. There was no one. The echo of the scream seemed to have been impregnated there, as if it had happened seconds before. I was convinced it wasn't just imagination. The air inside that room seemed heavier, as if it were loaded with something I couldn't explain. The silence suddenly became unbearable, and I had the clear feeling that someone was watching me from inside. I walked away, keeping my eyes fixed on the room until the door closed again with the wind. My whole body asked to get out of there as soon as possible. I started walking back to the stairs, now with fast steps, almost running, but trying to keep a minimum of calm, so as not to stumble in the dark. When I reached the stairwell again, I heard the echo of the steps again. But now they didn't come from above. They came from below, from the ground floor, exactly the same way I had used to enter. It was as if someone was climbing behind me, repeating my route, step by step. I didn't think twice. I ran down, jumping the last steps and crossing the corridor without looking back. Every second, I felt as if the sound of footsteps was reaching me, as if there was something invisible chasing my movements. I pushed the back door hard, and only stopped running when I reached the street. Outside, under the fine rain, I turned to look at the building. He looked like just another dead construction, lifeless, no sound. But inside me, I knew that that echo that accompanied me on the stairs had not been the result of my imagination. And that scream still echoed in my head, as if I had been stuck in the corridors of that place. I never went back there, but to this day, whenever I hear footsteps behind me in an empty corridor or an old building, I feel that same chill in my stomach. The echo of the stairs never left me. Story 10. But don't leave yet, because something unexpected comes after this one. I was never a big fan of entering abandoned places, but that weekend I agreed to accompany some friends to a gym closed for decades. They said it was used by local teams in the 70s, but that since then it had been left to moths. We entered through a side door that was backed only by a loose chain. The air was heavy, smelled of mold and rust, and each step echoed that creak that makes anyone uncomfortable. I was trying to distract myself with the lanterns dancing through the peeling walls when I noticed something hanging in front, right in the main corridor. It was a poster, unlike everything we've seen so far. While the walls were covered with old graffiti and torn posters, that one looked new, glued firmly and cleanly. I got closer, curious, and when the flashlight light hit, I felt my stomach sink. In black letters, scribbled by hand, my name was written. Megan. For a moment I thought I was imagining, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. The paper was dry, with no signs of wear, as if it had been placed there that same day. At the time, my friends came after me, asking what was so strange about it. I just pointed to the poster and waited for their reaction. None of them seemed to understand. They swore they hadn't done that they hadn't even moved away from the group. The feeling of being the target of a joke or something worse left me speechless. I kept trying to reason. How could that poster be there, so preserved, in a place where there was not even electricity and where no one entered for years? I decided to tear the poster off the wall, but when I pulled it I realized that it was stuck strangely firmly, as if it had been placed with something stronger than ordinary tape or glue. With each pull, the noise of the paper releasing echoed loudly through the empty gym. My friends got impatient and told me to leave it there, but I couldn't. It was my name, written in large and crooked letters, and it seemed addressed to me in a very personal way. When I finally let go of the poster, I had it in my hands and noticed something even more disturbing. Behind, there was another word written in smaller size. It was blurred, but it seemed to be here. I tried to show it to the others, but they said it was just a paint stain, that I was getting too impressed. But I knew what I had seen, and that made me even more anxious. We continued walking down the corridor, but with each step it seemed that the silence got thicker. I felt as if something moved from afar, always behind us. The flashlight of one of my friends failed for a few seconds, and in that short space of time, I swear I heard a trail of feet coming from inside one of the side rooms. No one wanted to check, but we all got more tense, trying to speed up the exit. With each empty room we passed, I couldn't get the image of the poster out of my head. It was as if someone had prepared that waiting for me specifically. I started to wonder if there were no hidden cameras, or if someone from the city knew we were going there that night. The coincidence was too absurd. I held the folded poster in my hand, but the feeling of carrying it only increased my anguish. When we arrived at the main court, the wind began to beat hard through the broken windows. The noise of the metal plates colliding seemed like a warning for us to leave. That's when one of my friends pointed to another wall. There was another poster, but this time in white. It seemed to have been put recently too. The vision made my whole body shiver. Without arguing, we decided to leave through the same entrance. As I crossed the corridor back, I instinctively turned to look at the wall where I found the first poster. He wasn't there anymore. Only the whitish mark of the paper that had been glued remained, as if it had never existed. I squeezed the folded piece that was still with me to make sure I wasn't going crazy, but for some reason that made me feel even more watched. When we finally went out into the street, the light rain began to fall, and even outdoors I couldn't relax. I got in the car, and before we threw the backpacks in the trunk, I decided to open the poster again. Only this time, there was nothing written on the back. The word "here" had simply disappeared, leaving only the paper blank. I shook so much that I almost dropped it on the wet floor. Since that day, I never went back to abandoned buildings. The poster disappeared from my house too. I had kept it folded in the desk drawer, but a week later it was no longer there. To this day I don't know if that was an elaborate prank or if someone was really watching us inside that gym. But whenever I pass near abandoned places, I have the feeling that I will find my name written again on some wall. And that's what I can't get out of my head. Was someone really waiting for me inside, or was it pure coincidence? Has it ever happened to you that you have found something so specific with your name in a place where no one should be? You've made it to the end. Thank you for listening until now. But before we close, I have one last story for you. I had already explored some abandoned places with friends, but that night I decided to go alone to a deactivated asylum near the city. The building was far away, surrounded by dry trees and a fallen fence, and everyone said it was dangerous. I just wanted to take some pictures and record the state of the place, but from the moment I entered, something seemed out of place. The air was dense, humid, with the smell of rotten wood and rust. The silence was only broken by the sound of my steps echoing in the long and dark corridors. After walking for a few minutes, I arrived at a wing that seemed more isolated, with doors lined up on both sides of the corridor. One of them was ajar. The light of my flashlight barely passed through the crack, illuminating only the dust suspended in the air. When I touched the handle and pushed lightly, I heard a dry and heavy noise coming from inside, as if something had fallen to the floor. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to hear something else, but silence dominated again. The first thing I thought was that maybe some object was poorly supported and had fallen by itself. But the way it sounded seemed different, as if it had been dragged before falling. Curiosity mixed with fear made me hesitate, but I ended up creating courage and opened the door for good. The room was completely empty, illuminated by the beam of my flashlight. There was no furniture, only peeling walls and dust covering everything. That's when I noticed the floor. The layer of powder was thick, but you could clearly see recent shoe marks going from a corner of the room to the opposite wall. They were well-defined steps, different from my boots, and they looked fresh, as if someone had been there just before I opened the door. The problem was, there was no exit in that room other than the door where I entered. I felt my stomach turn. The idea that someone could be hiding in there with me made my hands tremble. I looked in every corner, even to the ceiling, but there was no one. The footsteps simply stopped in the middle of the room, without explanation. I spent a few seconds trying to understand how that was possible. The silence was so deep that I began to hear the sound of my own breathing, fast and out of step. I decided to leave the room, but when I closed the door behind me, I heard a noise inside again, softer, as if something had slowly dragged on the floor. I didn't have the courage to open it again. I just walked away as fast as I could, with the flashlight shaking in my hand. The corridor seemed even longer than before, and each step echoed too loud. At the exit of the building, I still tried to rationalize. Maybe someone had entered before me and left those marks. Maybe there was a hidden passage in that room that I didn't see. But the feeling I had is that someone was watching me all the time, waiting for me to open that door. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but I never came back to check it out. Just remembering, I feel the same tension rising up my back, as if there was still something following me in the corridors of that place. And you, have you ever passed through an abandoned building and felt that there was someone inside with you, even without seeing anything? I'm really grateful for staying until the last minute. It's always good to know that you're here, listening to every detail. If you liked it, comment which part was the scariest for you. And of course, sign up to keep listening to stories as dark as this one. See you in the next video.